when the North awoke. It all begins in a landscape of ice, silence, and moisture. There is no precise date, no clear name to announce its beginning, only an ancient feeling, like the weight of frost upon a sleeping land. The wind blows through the trees, the sea crashes against the rocks, and in that solitude of the North, harsh, closed, deep, this story begins. Not with armies or flags, but with a way of life that grew in the shadows, until it burst violently in the least expected corners of Europe. They were called Vikings long after they named themselves that way. At first, they were nothing more than shadows on the sea. Sometimes they arrived like storms, unexpected, violent, unstoppable. Other times they slipped in like fog at dawn, crossing rivers and forests until they settled, traded, or vanished as if they had never been there. To some, they were demons in human form. To others, a force of nature. To themselves, they were men of the sea, of steel, of blood. Men who did not fear death because their story did not end in the grave. Before their swords forged empires, before their ships drew trade routes from the Atlantic to the Caspian Sea, before their gods were condemned to oblivion by Christian crosses, the Vikings were simply sons of the North, of a harsh, inhospitable North, isolated from the rest of the world. In that corner where the land does not forgive, where the sun disappears for months, where hunting is not always enough and the soil barely gives what is needed, only those who do not break survive. Or rather, those who do not know what it means to break. The harshness of their environment did not only shape their bodies, it shaped their collective soul. To be born in the Scandinavian lands, centuries before they were called by their modern names, was to be born in permanent struggle. The climate was a constant enemy. Winter was not a season. It was a cyclical punishment. Summer was brief, fleeting, barely enough to sow, harvest, repair tools, build ships, and prepare for what came next. And while the days were cold, the nights were long, eternal. In the darkness, stories arose, songs, verses etched in living memory, spoken by the warmth of the fire, when death waited on the threshold, and only the tale kept the soul awake. That is why from the beginning their culture was soaked in epic. Instead of prayers, they sang heroic deeds. Instead of obedience, they glorified boldness. They did not seek forgiveness. They sought transcendence. They did not beg their gods. They challenged them. That way of understanding the world would become the beating heart of the Viking world, even centuries later, when their descendants would take thrones, raise churches, and write in ink what was once screamed in blood. The Vikings were not an empire. They had no borders, nor a capital. They never built a great army nor imposed an official language. What they did have was an invisible but solid identity, a cultural network that united them beyond clans, distances, and internal wars. A connection woven in language, in religion, in oral law, in the ways of waging war, treating enemies, and negotiating power. Being a Viking was more than a nationality. It was a way of being in the world, an impulse toward risk, a need to look beyond the horizon. And although today we imagine them with horned helmets, a fantasy more from the 19th century than from historical reality, the truth is that their real appearance was far more terrifying. Men hardened by the cold, with rough hands, sharp eyes, untamed beards, and a way of moving that always seemed on the verge of attacking or retreating without warning. Danger was their language, and they spoke it fluently. But why did they arise at that exact moment? Why did a force capable of altering the course of European history suddenly emerge from that nearly invisible corner of the map? The answers lie not in a single cause, but in the precise combination of many. Population pressure, nautical innovations, internal conflicts, mythological tales that encouraged conquest, trade opportunities, political fractures in Europe. Everything converged toward a single turning point, and that point was not a physical place, but a collective will. The will to go out, explore, raid, trade, dominate, or die trying. The Viking awakening was not immediate. It was not a sudden explosion. It was a prolonged tremor. First in their own territories, with small skirmishes, local disputes, unstable alliances. Then on the seas, with increasingly daring voyages. And when the first monastery was looted, there was no turning back. The North had not only awakened, it had begun to speak with fire. But before diving into that age of assaults, beheaded kings, and alliances sealed with steel, it is necessary to understand the world that shaped them. The land that taught them to endure. The landscape that taught them that if they did not move, they would die. Because if we want to understand why they were the way they were, we must first walk with them upon the frost, breathe the same frozen air, and look up to a sky where the gods did not forgive weakness. So now that the roar of the North has been heard for the first time, it is time to slow down, open our eyes wide, and delve into the deepest corners of their origin. We go to the heart of Scandinavia, to the damp forests, to the remote villages, to the coasts jagged like blades. Because there, and only there, the story of the Vikings truly begins. The world where the Vikings were born. Before they crossed seas and set cities ablaze, before their names echoed in the chronicles of terrified monks or the cries of defeated kings, the Vikings grew up in a remote corner of the map. A place without marked roads, without castles, without empires. A land where nature ruled alone and where mere survival was a daily feat. I'm talking about Scandinavia in the centuries before the Viking Age. A landscape as beautiful as it was brutal, shaped generation after generation by an iron hand and icy winds. Because to understand who the Vikings were, one must first understand the land that forged them. 7th century Scandinavia was a harsh, deeply fragmented region, without a clear political center or major cities to organize power. Instead, there were scattered villages, small communities clustered around fjords, navigable lakes, and narrow valleys nestled between mountains. The landscape was rugged, blanketed in dense forests, and carved by hundreds of rivers that flowed like open veins through a rough and wild geography. Each community lived as best it could, isolated for months by snow, relying on the sea, livestock, short harvests, and unstable pacts between neighboring clans. The climate was a silent enemy. Winters were long, dry, and harsh. For weeks, even months, the sun seemed to forget the north. Night took hold of time, and homes became fortresses against the dark. Firewood, dried fish, salted meat, and animal hides were as valuable as gold. And when spring finally arrived, there was no time to waste. Boats had to be repaired, fields sown, animals hunted, structures built. All the necessary preparations made before the cycle of ice returned once more. Every year was a countdown. Every season had a purpose, and there was no room for error. This environment, with its relentless demands, shaped a culture rooted in practicality. Intelligence was not abstract. It meant surviving winter, knowing the land, reading the signs in the sky, moving quickly, acting decisively. There was no space for passivity. The weak fell, the strong adapted. The stories that survived from that time say it all. Heroes were not saints. They were clever, tough, sometimes cruel, but always brave. That idea, that the world is meant to be challenged, not merely endured, was born in these forests, among moss-covered rocks and fjords that breathed with the tides. The land was not generous. Scandinavia had little arable terrain. Fertile ground was scarce and fiercely contested. Agriculture, though present, was limited, and had to be supplemented with fishing, hunting, and herding. Pigs, reindeer, goats, herring and cod, forest berries. Everything had value. Nothing was wasted. Resources were scarce and precious, generating constant tension between clans. From that, alliances were born. Strategic marriages, betrayals, wars. Politics was as raw as the climate. In the absence of centralized power, authority rested with local figures, chieftains, clan leaders, respected elders. There was no king in the traditional sense. Each region had its own chiefs, and loyalty was earned through deeds, not titles. The relationship between power and territory was fluid, often negotiated through the thing. Popular assemblies where disputes were resolved, laws declared, and justice enacted. There, beneath the open sky, people spoke, voted, judged. It was a primitive form of self-government, but one deeply rooted in Scandinavian identity. That fragmented world also fostered a culture of mobility. Roads were unsafe, distances vast, so the sea became the great highway. From early on, the northern peoples learned to trust their boats, first to travel between islands, then to trade, and eventually to raid. Inland river routes were vital too, connecting the interior with the coast and enabling the movement of goods, people, and ideas. And with that constant movement, a pragmatic, open-minded, deal-making mentality began to take shape. The future Viking was already forming in that constant coming and going, in that tension between isolation and contact. But not everything was violence or survival. There was beauty too. A fierce, imposing beauty that filtered into their art, their oral poetry, the way they carved wood, built their homes, or adorned their weapons. The Scandinavians of that time believed in signs, in symbols, in forms that held meaning. The motifs we now recognize as Viking, interwoven dragons, serpents, spirals, were already present long before the first raid. They were expressions of a complex sensitivity, a blend of superstition, reverence for nature, and a need to make a mark in a world where everything could vanish overnight. Moreover, that relative isolation from the rest of Europe allowed them to preserve very ancient mythologies, beliefs that elsewhere had already been replaced by more organized religions. In Scandinavia, the gods still walked among men. They were not unreachable. They mingled with heroes, intervened in battles, demanded sacrifices. Religion was not found in stone temples, but in forests, in mountains, in songs chanted at dusk. This connection to the unseen would be essential to Viking mentality, a bridge between the real and the symbolic, between action and myth. Isolation also meant that Scandinavia developed at its own pace, untouched by the major transformations sweeping the continent. While kingdoms, churches, universities, and professional armies were emerging in the south, the north held on to a much older way of life, freer but also more dangerous. That temporal distance, that difference in speed, was one of the key reasons for the shock when the Vikings began to expand. To Europe, they seemed to come from the past. To them, it was simply their present. And that's where the key lies, in that dissonance. Because the Viking world did not appear out of nowhere. It was the natural evolution of a harsh land, a decentralized society, an unpredictable environment, and a mindset trained from birth to adapt, to endure, and to seize every opportunity. What others saw as the end of the world, they saw as a beginning. Where others saw danger, they saw possibility. So, before judging them for their raids, their wars, or their bloodthirsty gods, imagine what it meant to grow up among stone and ice, where success was measured by food on the table, and failure could mean being forgotten. Because from that lonely land, from those snow-covered villages, would soon come the men who would make the world tremble. And indeed, when a people is forged in resistance, their expansion is not a matter of if, but when. The religion that fueled war. To truly understand the Vikings, one must look beyond the swords, beyond the sails rising on their drakars, or the cities left in ruins behind them. What drove them into danger was not merely ambition or need, but something deeper. A worldview rooted in an ancient, wild religion perfectly attuned to their way of life. A religion without redemption or repentance, where gods were not moral guides but magnified reflections of the Vikings themselves. Exaggerated virtues, unleashed passions, and mistakes turned into legend. If the world was a battlefield, their religion offered no comfort. It offered cause. If life was short, there was no choice but to embrace it fiercely. The spiritual universe of the Scandinavian peoples bore little resemblance to the religions flourishing in Central Europe. There was no single authority, no sacred text defining right or wrong. Morality was not dictated by commandments, but by action, honor, and courage. The gods were many, complex, contradictory, and lived in a cosmos as chaotic as it was fascinating. At the center of the universe stood Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, its roots connecting all worlds. The world of humans, of giants, of gods, of the dead. Nothing was still. Everything was in motion, and everything, even the gods, had an inevitable fate. Odin was the principal god, though not the strongest or the fairest. He was the wisest, yes, but also the darkest. Lord of the dead, god of war and poetry, he wandered the world in disguise, seeking secrets, making pacts with monstrous beings, sacrificing parts of himself in pursuit of knowledge. He gave up his eye for wisdom and hanged himself from Yggdrasil for 9 nights to learn the runes, those magical letters containing the power of creation and destruction. He was not a fatherly or protective god. He was a god who demanded effort, pain, and sacrifice, a god who did not reward obedience, but valor. Thor, on the other hand, represented raw strength, thunder, unstoppable power. Armed with his hammer Mjolnir, he was humanity's protector against the giants of chaos, while Odin whispered secrets into the ears of sages and kings. Thor was the roar of the storm, the arm that hurled lightning and held back the end of the world for one more day. His image, closer to the common folk, was revered by farmers, craftsmen, and warriors alike. His hammer, a symbol of protection and fertility, was worn around the neck, carved into stone, and buried with the dead. And then there was Loki, the god of deceit, change, and betrayal. An ambiguous figure, necessary, yet always dangerous. In him lived uncontrollable chaos, the disorder that slips into even the most careful plans. He was both ally and enemy, father of monsters, instigator of Ragnarok, the end of the world. In Loki, the Vikings saw a reflection of what happens when balance is broken, when cunning triumphs over strength, and the world begins to shake. Viking mythology was deeply infused with the idea of the end. Everything had a conclusion. Even the gods would die. Even the universe would be consumed by fire and ice. Ragnarok, the final battle between the gods and the forces of chaos, was not a punishment. It was destiny. Not a threat, but a certainty. And that certainty shaped the way they lived. If everything was going to burn, if not even the gods would be spared, then what was the point of fearing death? Why postpone action? To live with honor, to die with bravery, that was true victory. The Vikings did not believe in an eternal paradise as a reward for obedient living. Their version of the afterlife was selective and fierce. Those who fell in battle with courage were carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, the great hall of warriors in Asgard, where they trained to fight in Ragnarok. Each day they battled. Each night they feasted. A glorious eternity spent preparing for the end of all things. That is why, for a Viking, dying with a sword in hand was no tragedy. It was a triumphant entrance into a new kind of life. But Valhalla was not the only destination. There was also Helheim, the realm of the dead who had not died gloriously. A cold, gray place, far from the songs of the Valkyries. A silent space, where souls wandered without purpose. Going there was not necessarily a moral punishment, but it was a disappointment. A death without combat was, in many cases, an incomplete life. Their religious practices were as intense as their beliefs. There were sacrificial rituals involving both animals and people. Offerings were made to balance the world, to appease the gods, to gain visions, or to seal pacts. Wooden temples, like the famed one at Uppsala, were sacred centers where clans gathered to celebrate festivals and worship the gods. But the sacred was not confined to a place. Any forest, stone, or spring could be deemed sacred if the signs were present. Rituals were often led by volvas, wise women, prophetesses, keepers of secrets. They were both feared and respected. It was said they could see the future, summon spirits, read the runes, and alter fate. Their power was not only religious but social. In a culture where words carried sacred weight, vulvas were walking oracles, and what they spoke often determined the course of action. Magic, poetry, and war were not separate. Warriors recited verses before battle, not as a distraction, but as an incantation. Words were carved into weapons, stones, bones. Everything carried meaning. Runes were not simple letters, but living symbols. They invoked, protected, cursed. Language was power, and those who mastered it could change the course of events. This vision of the world, so full of meaning, was the foundation that made the Viking more than just a warrior. He was a participant in a cosmic drama, another piece on a board where gods and monsters also played. And that constant awareness, that life was fragile, short, and part of a much greater story, gave strength to their choices. To raid, to explore, to take risks. These were not insane or impulsive acts. They were consistent with a faith that glorified action and scorned fear. That is why, when the Vikings sailed toward distant lands, they were not merely seeking wealth. They went to write their name into the history of the world, to live as their gods did, intensely, tragically, heroically. Now that we have traversed this spiritual landscape, now that we understand how they thought, why they fought, and what they expected after death, we are ready to cross the line of fire. The next step in their story will no longer be internal or symbolic. It will be real, tangible, and bloody. Because everything changed the day they decided to attack, for the first time, the heart of Christian Europe. The first attack that changed Europe. History doesn't always give warnings. Sometimes it strikes like lightning, splitting the sky in two, without forewarning. And once it hits, nothing is ever the same. That was the Viking attack on Lindisfarne. It wasn't a battle, nor a declared war. It was thunder in the middle of an apparently peaceful night. Christian Europe didn't see it coming, and by the time it reacted, it was too late. Something new, something terrifying, something uncontrollable had entered the game of power. The North had begun to move. The year was 793. On a small island off the northeastern coast of what we now call England stood a monastery, Lindisfarne. Founded over a century earlier by Irish monks, it was a place of peace, retreat, and contemplation, a jewel of early Christianity. Its walls were made of stone, but its strength lay in spirituality, in illuminated manuscripts, in prayers whispered at dawn, in the silent devotion of those who had consecrated their lives to the sacred. It wasn't a fortress, it was a sanctuary. And it was precisely for that reason that it was chosen as a target. That day there were no signs, no messengers, no challenges, no chance to prepare. A series of ships appeared on the horizon, low, swift vessels that seemed to glide over the water as if they were part of it. Tall men, clad in furs, their faces hardened by salt and cold, disembarked in silence. They carried swords, Axes, spears. They hadn't come to talk. They had come to take. The attack was swift, merciless, total. The monks were either massacred or enslaved. Relics were stolen, chalices and crosses melted down, Bibles torn apart, sacred walls desecrated. But the most devastating blow wasn't the material destruction. It was the broken symbol. Lindisfarne wasn't just any place. It was a spiritual beacon. Its violation was a message that traveled faster than any army. Those who heard it at first didn't understand what had happened. The account spoke of wild men from the sea who respected neither God nor his servants, who desecrated the sacred without fear of divine punishment. Some believed they were Saracens. Others thought they were beasts in disguise. No one had a clear explanation, because no one had imagined that such chaotic power could rise from those northern lands that Europe barely acknowledged on its maps. But it wasn't an isolated event. It was the beginning of a new era. Because Lindisfarne, as the opening blow, marked the awakening of a phenomenon that would repeat itself for decades, first in the British Isles, then on the continent, and eventually reaching the shores of the Mediterranean. It was as if an unstoppable tide had been unleashed, and after that first impact, there was no option but to adapt or perish. What truly unsettled the Europeans at the time wasn't just the ferocity of the attack. It was the fact that its perpetrators served no known king, answered to no treaties, claimed no land in the name of any empire. They were autonomous, independent, unpredictable. What they wanted, they took. What they couldn't carry off, they destroyed. Their aim was not immediate territorial conquest, but wealth and prestige. They raided for resources, yes, but also for glory. Because returning to the clan with gold and blood wasn't just a triumph, it was a declaration of status. The speed of the strike, the absence of recognizable rules, the utter disregard for religious institutions, made it impossible to fight them using the political tools of the time. While Christian kingdoms debated strategies, the Vikings were already elsewhere, sacking another monastery, burning another port, erasing another border. Lindisfarne, in that sense, was more than a tragedy. It was a revelation. It revealed the vulnerability of a Europe that thought itself secure, too focused on its own internal struggles to look beyond the sea. It also revealed the existence of an outside world, dynamic and willing to break in without asking for permission. And most importantly, it showed that the balance of power, that fragile web of alliances, fiefdoms, and faiths that maintain social order, could be shattered by a handful of determined and well-organized men. From then on, the Vikings ceased to be an unknown threat and became a constant presence. Ireland, Scotland, northern France, Flanders, and later even the heart of the Iberian Peninsula. Each landing had its own story, its own scar. But Lindisfarne was the first wound. And like any first wound, it is never forgotten. The church reacted with horror. Sermons became filled with apocalyptic references. Some interpreted the attack as divine punishment, a sign that Christian faith had weakened, that morality had decayed. Prayers multiplied, fasts intensified, penance was widespread. But none of that stopped the new invaders, because they hadn't come to negotiate with God. They had come for what lay behind the altars: precious metals, ivory-covered books, ceremonial cups, melted bells, chests hidden behind sacred stones. What began as an isolated act became a strategy. Monasteries were ideal targets, remote, wealthy, poorly defended. The Vikings quickly realized that fear was a powerful tool. After each attack, the legend grew. Many villages, upon seeing sails approach, fled before even trying to fight. Some buried their treasures. Others tried to negotiate. The chaos was total, but the message was clear. No one was safe. Lindisfarne also shows us that the Vikings were sharp observers. They knew when to strike, how to strike, and whom to strike. They understood maritime routes, weak points, religious cycles. They weren't blind barbarians driven by fury. They were strategists who understood the world they were attacking, even if they didn't share its values. And it was that understanding, precisely, that made them so effective. Today, when we look at the reconstructed monastery, now a place of remembrance, it's hard to imagine the terror of that day. Hard to picture the sound of boots on stone, the screams, the smoke, the sudden certainty that the world had changed. But it had. And it changed forever. Because after Lindisfarne, Europe stopped feeling invulnerable. The North, until then ignored or underestimated, became a real threat. And the Vikings, those men who came from the mists, ceased to be a shadow and became protagonists in the story. And now that the first blow has been told, the lightning has struck, and the storm begins to form, it's time to understand the how. What made them so fast, so effective, so elusive? What was the secret behind their mobility, their almost ghostly power to appear and vanish within hours? The answer, as so often in history, lay in technology, in the ships, in those sea beasts that seemed to breathe with the tide. The power of their ships and the terror of the sea. To understand why the Vikings achieved what they did, one must momentarily set aside the swords, the screams, the flames, and look to the sea. There lies the key. Upon the endless blue surface where they traced invisible routes no one else had dared to explore. The Viking advantage wasn't just in their bravery or brutality. It lay in their absolute mastery of the waters. What other people saw as a boundary, they saw as a promise. Where others saw danger, they charted paths, and they did so aboard one of the most astonishing nautical creations history has ever known, the Drakkar. That name, which now echoes like some ancient roar, refers to the long, slender, and menacing ship that features so prominently in modern images of the Vikings. But the Drakkar was no museum piece, no ceremonial relic. It was a living creature, carved from northern timber, crafted with such precision that even modern archaeologists were astonished. The Drakkar was far more than a means of transport. It was an extension of the warrior's body, an instrument of war, of travel, and of identity. Its structure was surprisingly light and flexible, allowing it to move with extraordinary agility across the waters, even in stormy seas. The secret lay in the overlapping planks of its hull, a technique known as clinker, which gave it resilience without sacrificing speed. These ships could be propelled by oars or sail, depending on the wind conditions, allowing them to adapt to any scenario. If the sea was calm, the oars came into play. If the wind favored them, the large square sail was unfurled and pushed them forward like hunters pursued by the gods. But the most striking feature of the Drakkar was not its speed, but its draft. Its design allowed it to navigate extremely shallow waters, which meant it could sail up rivers, into canals and estuaries, and even land directly on beaches or sandbanks. This completely changed the rules of engagement. There was no longer a need to attack fortified ports. They could appear in remote villages, isolated monasteries, open fields. And by the time their enemies tried to pursue them, they had already vanished back into the sea, leaving behind only smoke, corpses, and confusion. This ability to disappear was as vital as their ability to strike. The Vikings did not fight like traditional armies. They did not wait for reinforcements or organize long campaigns. They struck and vanished, like thunder rumbling across the sky but never caught. And the Drakkar was their means to do it. Its elongated form, often adorned with a dragon or serpent head at the prow, served both to intimidate and to project a symbol of power. When someone spotted a Drakkar on the horizon, they knew the time for prayer had ended. Not all Drakkar were the same. There were smaller variants for trade or exploration, like the Nar, designed to carry goods and cover longer distances. But when it came to war, the Drakkar was king. It could carry between 40 and 60 men, armed, trained and ready to disembark in seconds. It needed no ports or docks. They arrived, leapt into the water, and the fight began. That speed was lethal. Coastal towns, which had until then lived with their backs to the sea, began building walls, watchtowers, and defensive beacons. But it was often not enough. What's most fascinating about the Viking world is that there was no clear division between sea and land. Everything was connected. The ships were not just external tools to be used and set aside. They were part of life. Every village had some access to water. Every youth learned to row, to sail, to read the stars and the currents. And when a Viking died, if he was deemed worthy, he was sometimes buried with his ship. Not with a cross, but with the vessel that had been his home, his shield, and his sword. One of the most revealing archaeological discoveries was that of the Oseberg ship, found in a burial mound in southern Norway. There, beneath a mound of earth, rested a magnificently carved vessel, adorned with intricate dragon motifs and interlaced knots, astonishingly well preserved. It was no mere mode of transport. It was a floating work of art. Within it lay two high-ranking women, accompanied by luxury goods, sacrificed animals, and ceremonial items. This was more than a burial. It was a testament to the absolute reverence the Vikings held for their ships. Thanks to their ships, the Vikings didn't just attack. They explored, they colonized, they traded. They traveled to Iceland, to Greenland, even to North America, centuries before any other European set foot there. What the Drakar offered them was something no other people of the time possessed: total freedom of movement. They were not tied to fixed routes or roads controlled by empires. Their world was liquid. Their maps were drawn in seafoam. And all of this translated, in practice, into an overwhelming military advantage. While continental armies moved slowly, burdened with clumsy logistics and messages that took weeks to arrive, the Vikings were already moving toward another target. They moved ahead of time itself. They were the future, in a present still anchored in medieval forms of warfare. The sea, to them, was no obstacle. It was their home. They learned to read it as others read sacred texts. They knew when to sail, when to wait, when to change direction. And that's why they were feared. Because they could appear anywhere at any hour. Sometimes under the moon, sometimes at dawn, without warning. And always with that unmistakable image. A long ship, a red and white sail, a dragon's head floating above the waves. It was as if the sea had grown flesh, as if the elements, wind, water, fire, had joined together in a single strike. The Drakar did not just carry warriors, it carried fear. And that fear crossed borders, broke defenses, paralyzed entire cities. Medieval chroniclers did not exaggerate when they wrote of it as though it were a demon with scales. To them, it was something supernatural. And in a way, it was. But like all human creations, even ships have their limits. As Viking power grew, their enemies began to learn. They started copying their designs. Coastal defenses became more effective. The sea remained an ally, but it was no longer theirs alone. Before that change came, however, the Vikings made the most of that singular advantage. With their Drakar, they sowed chaos. With their Drakar, they connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean, the North Sea to the rivers of Russia, Scandinavia to the heart of Europe. And so, while empires trembled and monasteries burned, the sea sang a single song, the song of the North, carried by the waves, marked by the oars, etched into the wood of ships that feared nothing. Now that we understand the key to their speed, their unpredictability, and the liquid terror that traveled with them, it is time to delve into their strategy. Because what they did on the water had a direct reflection on land. How they arrived was important, but what they did once they were there, that was devastating. the art of attacking and disappearing. The most powerful image of the Viking world isn't in the act of wielding a sword, nor in the violence of open battle, not even in the blood staining the snow. It lies in that haunting moment just after the attack, when everything is over and the ships vanish beyond the horizon. The silence after the chaos, the smoldering village, the survivors staring out to sea, searching for answers in an emptiness no one can explain. That is the essence of the Viking tactic. To strike with surgical precision, to sow terror through perfectly calculated violence, and to vanish without a trace, as if they had emerged from the mist and returned to it. That ability to disappear as quickly as they had arrived was what made them invincible for decades. It wasn't brute strength. It wasn't the number of warriors. It was time. The use of time as a weapon. The Vikings didn't need to defeat entire armies. It was enough to destabilize the heart of local structures. They knew exactly how long they could remain on land before an organized force would mobilize. And they always left a few steps ahead. If they attacked at night, they were gone by dawn. If they landed at noon, they were back at sea by sunset. It was like a dance with the enemy, but only one side knew the steps. And to pull that off, being fast wasn't enough. They had to know the terrain. Intelligence was vital. Before each raid, the Vikings studied the target. They spied from the sea, interrogated prisoners, gathered information from merchants, or even through previous alliances with other clans. Nothing was improvised. Even in their apparent brutality, there was precise calculation. They knew if market day was being held. They knew if the village chief was away. They knew if the temple stored gold or just worthless relics. Every raid had a purpose, and every minute mattered. One of their most effective strategies was fragmentation. They attacked in small groups, divided but perfectly coordinated. They didn't arrive like a marching army, but like a pack of scattered wolves. Some came through the river, others by land, others in smaller boats. While one set the village center on fire, another blocked access to the warehouses, and another captured hostages or eliminated potential leaders. In a matter of minutes, everything was under control, and as the smoke began to rise, they were already packing up. The loot wasn't dragged away. It was prepared in advance, packed into sacks and backpacks, swiftly loaded onto the ships with a speed that seemed rehearsed, because in fact it was. The Vikings trained for this. Speed was no accident. It was part of their martial culture. From a young age, they learned to move as a group, to load and unload with precision, to read the leader's signals without words. Their combat style wasn't based on drawn-out confrontations, but on efficiency. They got in and got out, like a wound that isn't noticed until it's already bled too much. And if they had to fight, they fought without mercy, but never without purpose. A crucial part of this art of disappearing was the fear they left behind. Terror became a force multiplier. A village that had heard of the Vikings, that had seen the destruction in a neighboring settlement, would react with panic. That reaction, that panic, was part of the plan. Many times the Vikings didn't even need to land. Their mere presence was enough to cause evacuations, surrenders, or even tribute offered in advance. In other words, they won without fighting. Because the memory of the last attack was still fresh. Because no one knew when or where they would strike next. That unpredictability was another of their most effective weapons. They didn't follow a seasonal campaign logic, didn't respond to provocations, didn't respect Christian truces. They could attack on Christmas Day, during a wedding, in the middle of a religious festival, and the next day, attack again, in a completely different place. Chroniclers of the time describe that feeling of helplessness, of not being able to anticipate, of not knowing whether they were defending the right place or if it was already too late. Alarm systems were useless against enemies who gave no warning of their arrival. And like fire that moves with the wind, the Vikings knew how to adapt. If they met resistance, they didn't stubbornly try to win out of pride. They withdrew, changed tactics, chose another target. They never committed to a hopeless fight. They knew when to advance and when to vanish. That's why they survived for so long. That's how they crossed half a continent without an empire or a flag. But it would be a mistake to think their only motivation was plunder. Behind each attack there were layers of intention. Sometimes they sought gold, yes. Other times, slaves. Other times, to send a message to a political enemy. On occasion, they were simply exploring. Sometimes they raided a site not for what it contained, but for what it symbolized. A monastery, for example, didn't just hold riches. It represented the spiritual heart of a people. Destroying it demoralized the enemy without needing to face their army. That psychological dimension was an integral part of their strategy. They understood fear as a resource. They used it masterfully. They left certain witnesses alive to recount what had happened. They arranged corpses ceremonially as a warning. They defiled sacred symbols to show they didn't respect local rules. Every attack was a macabre performance, designed to embed itself in collective memory. But there's something more, something subtler and deeper. This method of attacking and disappearing also reflected their worldview. A world in constant motion, where nothing is permanent, where even the gods are fated to die, where the only way to live with dignity is to act, to win, to survive, and to keep moving forward. In that philosophy, there is no glory in waiting. Glory lies in motion, in risk, in leaving a mark on history with a precise action, and then melting back into the sea. This method of warfare gave them the upper hand for generations. But like all things in history, it eventually met its limits. Populations began to organize. Coastal defenses became more sophisticated. Alliances between kingdoms grew stronger. Little by little, attacking and disappearing was no longer so easy. And when that happened, the Vikings proved something else. They weren't tied to a single way of operating. They knew how to transform. They founded colonies, made pacts, ruled. But that is another story. For now, we remain in this fascinating chapter, where their strength resided in their absence, in the shadow they left behind, in the fear that traveled faster than their ships, in that unmatched ability to strike like a gust of wind and disappear, leaving behind nothing but a silence impossible to ignore. And now that we understand how they attacked, how they planned, how they erased their traces before anyone could catch them, it's time to look inward. What were they like among themselves? What rules did they follow? Who held power? And what happened when they weren't raiding, but simply living? We delve now into the structure of their society, into the order that held the tribe together, into the law of steel and of honor. The law of steel and honor. For a long time, Vikings were described as lawless savages, men living outside of order, raiding for the sake of it and killing on instinct. That vision, spread by those who suffered under them and later distorted by centuries of fantasy, ignores an essential detail. No people can sustain itself over generations without clear rules, without structure, without a foundation to organize coexistence, regulate conflict, and ensure that when one returns from battle or a trade expedition, there's still a home standing, a community whose ties remain intact. And that foundation, in the Viking world, was a sharp-edged blend of tradition, spoken word, and when all else failed, steel. At the center of their social organization was the clan. Every individual belonged to an extended family, and that belonging defined their place in the world. Loyalty to one's lineage came before all else. It could mean protection, but also condemnation, because any individual act, an insult, a murder, a theft, affected the entire group. Shame wasn't personal, it was collective. That's why honor was something cultivated, defended tooth and nail, and if lost, could drag an entire family into ruin. Dishonor wasn't mended with apologies, but with blood or compensation. The figure of the Jarl, the local leader, was essential for maintaining that balance. He wasn't an absolute monarch, but his word carried weight. He led in war, organized expeditions, and mediated internal disputes. His power came from respect, not imposition, and that respect had to be earned with courage, cunning, and generosity. A Jarl who failed to share spoils fairly, who showed cowardice or made unjust decisions, could be replaced. Not through betrayal, but out of necessity. Below him in the social scale were the Carls, free men who made up the majority of the population, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, warriors. They were the heart of the community. They had a voice in assemblies, could bear arms, make decisions about their households, and demand justice if wronged. Then came the thralls, the slaves, men and women with no rights, many of them captured during raids. Their lives didn't carry the same legal weight, but they weren't mere tools either. They could earn their freedom, integrate, even marry a free person if the context allowed it. Slavery in the Viking world was brutal, yes, but also mobile, making it different from more rigid forms of servitude in history. But the true pillar of communal life was the Thing. That was the name for popular assemblies where laws were debated, conflicts resolved, and important decisions made. These gatherings, which could last several days and include feasts, marriage alliances, and political pacts, allowed free men to exercise their right to speak, vote, and, if necessary, fight. Because the Thing wasn't a debate forum in the modern sense, it was a space where words and swords went hand in hand. The law, though unwritten, was known and respected. It was passed down through generations by the law speakers, men who memorized codes, precedents, and punishments. Their role was crucial. They had to recite the rules precisely, without error, and their word was binding. Thanks to them, tradition stayed alive. Viking legality was based on balance. For every action, there was a reaction. If someone killed a member of another clan, they had to pay a wergeld, a monetary compensation calculated based on the deceased's social status. If it wasn't paid, the offended clan could seek vengeance, and that vengeance was accepted as a form of justice. Ritual duels were another way to settle grievances. Two men, face to face, with witnesses, fought until one yielded or died. It wasn't a spectacle, it was an act of legitimacy. The winner didn't just win the fight, he won the argument, and that outcome had to be accepted by the community. In a world where written words were rare and authority was dispersed, strength had evidentiary value. It wasn't enough to be right, you had to prove it, but to reduce everything to violence would be a mistake. The Viking world deeply valued the spoken word. Pacts were sacred. A broken oath could have disastrous consequences. Alliances between clans, negotiated marriages, trade agreements, all were sealed with verbal commitments that weren't taken lightly. Lying wasn't just an ethical failing, it was a threat to social balance. Honor, then, was the most valuable currency. It was earned in battle, yes, but also in managing the household, in generosity to guests, in protecting the vulnerable, in loyalty to the clan. A man could be poor and still respected if he had honor. A jarl could be wealthy and still despised if he had lost it. Honor wasn't inherited. It was built every day. And once stained, it could taint everything it touched. Hospitality was part of that invisible code. A visitor, even a defeated enemy, had to be treated with dignity if he came in peace. Sharing food, fire, and conversation was a way of strengthening social bonds. It was both an act of courtesy and a display of strength. Only those secure in themselves could open their home to others. There was also a mystical dimension to this structure. Many believed that honor extended beyond life, that acts in this world echoed in the next, that a brave warrior could inspire his descendants, and that a coward would bring misfortune upon his lineage. That's why the judgment of the community wasn't the only one that mattered. There was also the judgment of the ancestors, of the gods, of the sagas that would one day tell your story. In this network of oral laws, social rituals, unwritten codes, and respect earned through concrete actions, a civilization was built that may have seemed to live on the margins of the world, but that had its own rules, as strict as any written law. And that explains why Vikings could sail for months, face unknown enemies, and return home knowing their bonds remained intact. Because their society wasn't built on material structures, but on internalized principles. Because what united them wasn't a throne or a border, but a way of understanding the world. And that way, shaped by strength, word, and duty, would become the foundation upon which they built kingdoms, negotiated alliances, and, as we'll see later, integrated other peoples without losing their essence. But before reaching that point, we must look at something long overlooked. A part of their world not found in battlefields, altars, or laws. It's in the homes, in the farms, in daily decisions, and yes, also in combat. I'm talking about the role of Viking women, powerful, active, decisive figures whom official history tried to erase, but who left a mark as real as any rune carved in stone. The women who also wielded the sword. For centuries, official history, the one written from pulpits, monastic libraries, and European thrones, tried to reduce Viking women to a role of shadow, as if their only function had been to wait for the warrior's return, raise children, weave, and pray in silence. But the same land that forged Viking men also shaped very different women. Women who were hard to tame, marked by the same need for resilience, by the same fierce relationship with life and death. And it was on that rugged, demanding terrain that a surprising figure emerged. The Viking woman. Not as a mere companion, but as an active presence, sometimes brutal, sometimes wise, but always decisive. To understand this, one must picture daily life in Scandinavia before the Viking expansion. There was no grand court to centralize power, no system that confined women indoors. Villages were scattered among fjords, mountains, and plains, and every household required strength and determination just to endure. In that context, women were no social ornament. They were household administrators, property guardians, and if the man was away, as was often the case during times of trade or war, it was the women who ran the family economy, organized local defense, and made life or death decisions. Viking law acknowledged their legal capacity to inherit, to own property, to request divorce, and in certain cases to exercise custody of children or claim vengeance for grievances. This didn't amount to full equality in the modern sense, but it did grant them a remarkable level of autonomy compared to other contemporary cultures. The word of a free woman held weight. Her choices could change the course of an entire family. Her presence in public assemblies, while less common, was neither impossible nor scandalous. But what has fascinated the most, and still sparks debate today, is the existence of warrior women, the famed shield maidens, women who not only took up arms in self-defense, but also actively participated in campaigns, led armed bands, and left behind lives shaped by combat. For a long time, they were thought to be nothing more than mythical figures, like Valkyries, designed to inspire, not to be real. But archaeological discoveries began to tell a different story. One of the most striking finds was a grave in Birka, Sweden, originally excavated in the late 19th century and long attributed to a high-ranking male warrior because of its contents: weapons, 2 horses, a strategic gaming board, and military status symbols. More than a century later, DNA analysis confirmed that the skeleton belonged to a woman, not the companion or wife of a warrior, but the warrior herself. The revelation sparked controversy. Some refused to accept it. But there she was, with the same weapons, the same funerary honors, the same prestigious burial reserved for military leaders. And this case isn't unique. There are records of female graves containing weapons across various Scandinavian regions. And while not all Viking women fought, just as not all men did, the possibility existed. Not as a quaint exception, but as part of the cultural landscape. Icelandic sagas, an essential source for understanding Viking mentality, mention women who take vengeance into their own hands, who lead raids, who wield swords skillfully. Some, like Lagertha, blur the line between myth and reality, but others appear to have had solid historical roots. It isn't hard to imagine. In a society where honor was a shared obligation, where prestige wasn't inherited but earned, and where violence was woven into daily life, women could not be expected to remain passive observers. When a family was wronged, a woman had the right, and at times the duty, to demand compensation, to summon the thing, the assembly, or to avenge if justice was denied. And if taking up a weapon was the only path, she did not shy away from it. Yet the sword was not their only source of power. Women also held sway in the spiritual realm. The Volvas, the priestesses, seers, or witches of the Norse world, were figures of fear and reverence. They could foresee the future, cast curses, interpret signs, and mediate between the living and the dead. Their authority extended beyond the everyday. They led complex rituals, conducted sacred ceremonies, and in some cases, influenced political decisions through their esoteric knowledge. In a world where magic was as real as the physical, they were the keepers of the unseen. Viking culture held a particular respect for the feminine as a force, as mystery, as balance. The Norse pantheon reflects this. Goddesses were not mere consorts. Freyja, for instance, was goddess of both love and war. It was said she welcomed half of the fallen warriors into her hall, while the other half went to Odin's Valhalla. She was also a practitioner of Seidr, the most powerful and complex form of magic. Her image blended beauty, desire, danger, and knowledge. In her, the ambiguity of the feminine in Viking life was fully embodied. Seduction, yes, but also command. Even in poetry, women held an active place. The skaldic poets, female bards, composed verses of war, of love, of mourning. Their voices were not silenced. On the contrary, in some cases, theirs was the only voice deemed legitimate enough to recount certain events, and their words traveled further than any sword. Motherhood, too, was not seen as a passive role. Raising children meant preparing them for life, for combat, for decision-making. Many women were responsible for shaping future warriors, not just physically, but psychologically. They passed down stories, values, tactics. They were builders of identity, and if the husband died, it was she who ensured the continuity of the bloodline, the honoring of alliances, the management of property, and the defense of the home. This female strength doesn't mean gender violence didn't exist. It did, as in all ancient societies. But the Viking woman's legal and social space gave her tools that other women in Christian Europe simply didn't have at the time. That difference is key to understanding why, in the collective imagination, the Viking woman endures as a symbol of power. The world they inhabited wasn't necessarily fairer, but it was more open to female action. A world where a woman could become a leader, a warrior, a judge, or a prophetess, if circumstances allowed, and if she had the strength to hold her ground. That is not easily forgotten. It lingers in the graves, the texts, the stones. And though it was long silenced, today it is being heard again. In that ancient echo, full of fury, resolve, and mystery, live the voices of all those who did not wait to be written into history, but instead carved their place into it with the same fierce will as their brothers. And it was precisely thanks to that solid family structure, to that society where courage was recognized regardless of gender, that the Vikings were not only able to raid and vanish, but also to settle, negotiate, and adapt. We'll see that soon, as they cross into England for good and turn raiding into occupation. The conquest that became a kingdom. When the first Dracares tore through the mists of the British coast, no one could have imagined that those men from the north, those warriors who rose from the sea with the roar of thunder and vanished like smoke, would end up staying. At first, they were shadows, raiders, church robbers, hunters of silver. But over time, they became something more. Their presence ceased to be fleeting and began to take root. Where there had once been ruin, there were now settlements. Where there had been fire, there was cultivation. And where only fear had existed, a new form of power emerged. Thus began one of the most astonishing transformations of the European Middle Ages. The slow, complex, and fascinating shift of the Vikings from raiders to kings of the very lands they had once plundered. England at that time was a patchwork of divided kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, each with its own king, its own army, its own traditions. This fragmentation was at first an advantage for the invaders. They weren't facing a single unified power, but rather a web of rivals who often fought each other, weakening themselves in the process. The Vikings read that broken map with surgical precision. They didn't come to conquer England in a single campaign. They came in waves, learning, probing, watching. And when the moment was right, they advanced with a resolve that would shape the island's destiny for generations. Starting in the year 865, a new kind of invasion upset the balance of power. The so-called Great Heathen Army landed in England. This was no longer a band of opportunistic raiders, but an organized force with defined leaders, concrete goals, and a deliberate strategy of occupation. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and other legendary chieftains led the charge. Their mission was not merely to steal and depart. It was to seize territory, establish footholds, and ensure that what was taken would not be lost upon returning north. Within a few years, vast regions of England fell under Viking control. Thus was born the Danelaw, a territory where Viking laws, customs, and governance began to replace, or forcibly coexist with, Anglo-Saxon institutions. It was a slow process, fraught with tension, truces, betrayals, and cultural fusion. But it happened. And in this new order, the Viking was no longer a foreigner. He became a settler, a farmer, a judge, a local chieftain. The same men who once burned churches now defended them. They raised children there, traded goods with Anglo-Saxon neighbors. In some areas, they even adopted the local language, or blended it with their own, creating unique dialects that would survive for centuries. This change of identity was neither easy nor peaceful. Many kingdoms resisted. Kings like Alfred the Great of Wessex recognized the danger and responded with strategy, reorganizing the southern English defense, building fortifications, training local militias, and forging alliances to halt the Viking advance. It was a fierce struggle, not just of swords, but of wills. And though Alfred couldn't expel them entirely, he managed to stop their expansion and safeguard the survival of Wessex, which would later become the heart of a unified England. Yet despite that resistance, the Vikings remained. Some Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were fully absorbed, cities transformed. York, renamed Jorvik, became a thriving Viking capital, center of commerce, culture, and power. Under Norse leadership, trade routes emerged that connected England to Ireland, Scandinavia, and beyond. Coinage was minted, lasting agricultural settlements were established, and the memory of chaos gave way to a new kind of order. One of the most fascinating aspects of this era is how the Vikings adapted their customs to the English environment. They didn't impose a closed system. Instead, they blended their traditions with local frameworks. The Norse thing coexisted with Anglo-Saxon institutions. Norse oral laws shaped court rulings, yet adapted to local needs. Even religious practices began to shift. Some Viking leaders converted to Christianity, sometimes out of conviction, sometimes for political gain, but always as part of a broader process of integration. This cultural fusion produced unexpected outcomes. In many regions, mixed marriages became common. Traditions intertwined. Norse sagas were told in English, and the children born of these unions grew up with a foot in each world. They were half Viking, half Anglo-Saxon. They spoke two languages, prayed to two gods, and inherited two very different worldviews. In them, the ultimate transformation was embodied. They were no longer invaders. They were the new inhabitants of a land they had begun to call home. But no conquest comes without conflict. As the Vikings entrenched themselves, internal tensions emerged. Not all clans agreed on how to govern, which treaties to honor, which lands to cede, or which faith to follow. There were wars between Vikings, betrayals within the Danelaw, and constant pressure from surviving English kingdoms. The story of this occupation is not a straight line. It's a tide that rises and falls, advances and retreats, but leaves a deep imprint on the landscape, on the laws, on the names of places, on the very blood of the people. And that imprint remains visible even today, in surnames ending in son, in everyday English words with Old Norse origins, in place names, in rituals, in folk songs that blend styles, meters, and symbols. The Viking impact on England wasn't fleeting. It was structural. It altered the course of its history forever. By the 11th century, some descendants of these once feared invaders would become recognized kings, legitimized by the church, allied with other European monarchs. The cycle had come full circle, from raiders to rulers, from violence to governance. Yet the memory of the sea remained alive. Though clad in Christian robes and golden crowns, those kings still carried in their eyes the reflection of northern waters. And while they were consolidating power in England through the Danelaw, another Viking current, less known but just as influential, was forging eastward. Through vast rivers and mysterious lands, they navigated toward a world where gold flowed from Byzantium and the steppes hid sleeping empires. Their ambition knew no borders. Their compass pointed to risk, and their story was far from over. The empire they built in the east. While the Christian chronicles of the West told with horror how the Vikings burned churches and pillaged coastlines, on the other side of the continent, far from the noise of English monasteries and Frankish battlefields, another story was unfolding. A story less known, written not in blood on parchment but in silence on water. A story that doesn't begin with sieges, but with journeys. Because while some Vikings sailed westward toward the British Isles, others, born farther east in Scandinavia, drifted downriver into vast and unfamiliar lands, following the paths of great rivers, exploring a world no Norseman had ever dared to traverse. They were the Swedes, or more precisely, the Varangians, adventurers, traders, explorers, many of them from what we now call Sweden, who chose not to look to the west, but to the east, toward the endless forests that stretched beyond the Baltic Sea. Their destination wasn't a particular land, but a network of waterways that connected the north to the south, crossing frigid plains, boundless woods, and nascent cities. The Dnieper and Volga rivers became their roads. They descended along them in boats that could be dismantled and carried across land when needed, navigating rapids, skirting swamps, venturing into a continent unprepared for them, but unable to resist their drive. These men did not carry crowns, banners, or crusades. They carried tools of trade, furs, weapons, amber, slaves. And yes, of course, they also carried their swords. But combat wasn't their main goal. They sought routes, opportunities, alliances, and they found far more than that. In the heart of those lands, At the crossroads between the Baltic and the Caspian Seas, they discovered a vast, disorganized, wealthy, and vulnerable world. Slavic peoples lived there, along with Turkic tribes, Caucasian merchants, and emissaries of Islam. And in the midst of such diversity, the Vikings realized they had something unique to offer: stability, security, power. And so, the Rus were born. That word, destined to become the root of Russia, has Scandinavian origins. It likely comes from the term roder, meaning to row, which suited perfectly those men who lived upon the water. When they settled, they didn't impose a new culture, but acted as leaders of scattered communities, intermediaries among peoples who couldn't understand one another. They controlled the rivers, levied tribute, administered justice. Soon, they began to be recognized as chiefs, eventually even as princes. And with power came structure. That's how, in the 9th century, the figure of Rurik emerged, the founder of a dynasty that would rule for centuries. Rurik, according to the region's oldest chronicle, was invited by the Slavic peoples to govern them, tired of anarchy and internal feuds. Though this detail is likely embellished by legend, it holds a deeper truth. The Eastern Vikings didn't conquer through brute force. They embedded themselves in the social fabric, strengthened it, and then shaped it in their image. From their capital in Novgorod, Rurik and his descendants expanded southward, eventually founding what would become Kiev and giving rise to a new kind of power, hybrid and ambitious. Kiev became a gem. Strategically positioned on the banks of the Dnieper, it opened itself to trade with Byzantium, with the Islamic world, with the steppes, and with the Scandinavian north. From there, the Varangian Rus launched both diplomatic and military missions toward Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and one of the most powerful political centers of the world. And they did not arrive as supplicants. Byzantine sources spoke of the Vikings with respect and even a hint of alarm. They were described as tall, disciplined, imposing men. Once, they reached the city's gates with hundreds of ships, not to conquer, but to negotiate. And they achieved the unthinkable. Not only did they secure favorable trade treaties, but some of them were recruited as elite mercenaries. Thus was born the Varangian Guard, a special unit made up of northern warriors, who for generations protected the Byzantine emperor with unwavering loyalty. They were valued for their strength, discipline, and political independence. Uninvolved in local intrigues, they were outsiders, precisely what made them trustworthy. Those who once crossed rivers as strangers now stood watch over the richest throne in Eastern Christendom. This relationship with Byzantium brought with it a phenomenon of immense consequence: the conversion to Orthodox Christianity. In the year 988, Prince Vladimir adopted the faith and made it the official religion of Kievan Rus. It was a political gesture, but also a cultural turning point. With the cross came alphabets, churches, and books. The world that had once been oral began to be written. And the Vikings, now in their 3rd or 4th generation on these lands, assumed a new identity, without ever fully abandoning the old. Because beneath their Christian robes, the Viking memory still pulsed. Their political structures, commercial practices, military organization, even some funeral rites, still echoed their Scandinavian roots. Burial mounds, weapons laid beside the dead, legends passed down by elders. All of it endured, though now it shared space with golden crosses and orthodox domes. The Varangian Empire of the East, though never formally an empire, functioned as one. It ruled vast territories, collected tribute, minted currency, founded cities. And it did so through a flexible, decentralized logic that turned geography into an advantage. While the West struggled to defend fixed borders, the Vikings of the East ruled through routes, rivers, and agreements. That gave them a remarkable edge. But no power lasts forever. Over time, Internal pressures, succession disputes, and external assaults, especially from the nomadic peoples of the steppes, weakened Kievan Rus. The great city, once a rival in splendor to Constantinople, began to fracture. Independent principalities emerged, unity faded, and though the Varangian figure gradually vanished, their legacy became irreversible. From that improbable convergence of Nordic traders, Slavic tribes, and Byzantine diplomacy, a new world was born. A world that would, in time, become Russia. And so, without grand pitched battles or spectacular coronations, the Vikings of the East built a lasting power. A fluid empire, adaptable and resilient, founded on movement, negotiation, and a unique talent for integration. While their western kin were still fighting for territory in England, those in the east managed networks connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea, Scandinavia to Persia, Kiev to Constantinople. An empire without a fixed map, but with real reach. A power that didn't shout, but still made itself heard. And above all, a deep, though quiet imprint on the history of a region that still bears in its name the echo of the men who rode. And just as the East was conquered through patience and trade, the Viking world also flourished by exchanging goods, ideas, and cultures. Because behind the axes and shields, there were also markets, metals, spices, and roots. Trade was not a side activity. It was the backbone of their expansion. The market where blood and silver flowed. When we think of the Vikings, the first impulse is to picture fire, swords, and the thunder of boots pounding on pillaged soil. And while that image holds some truth, it also hides something deeper, more complex, even more surprising. Because if we take a closer look at their journey through history, we'll find they were not simply sea-borne raiders, but also architects of vast, sophisticated, and extraordinarily profitable trade networks. Where blood flowed, silver also ran. And wherever their ships made landfall, chaos might only be the prologue to thriving commerce. The Vikings were, in many ways, the great middlemen of their time. They moved between worlds, between the frozen north and the desert caliphates, between Scandinavian mines and the markets of Baghdad, between the British coasts and the river routes of the east. Where others saw impossible distances, they drew connections. Every fjord, every river, every crossroads could become a critical node in their commercial map. And that map, though invisible to most Europeans of their day, had a precise logic. Follow the value, find the demand, secure control. One of the nerve centers of this trade was Hedeby, a port city in what is now northern Germany, on the frontier between the Germanic and Scandinavian worlds. From there, goods departed and arrived that had traveled thousands of kilometers. Ivory from North Africa, silk from Byzantium, spices from the Arab world, Baltic pearls, French wine, Arctic furs, and above all, silver. Lots of silver. Because if the Viking merchants had a shared obsession, it was this: to fill their chests with coins and ingots, even if those coins had no monetary value in their homelands. What mattered wasn't what they represented, it was what they weighed. Archaeological excavations in Hedeby have revealed something astonishing. Not only have buried treasures of precious metals been unearthed, but also measuring tools, finely calibrated balances, and lead weights accurate to the gram. These discoveries speak to a level of commercial precision that defies any notion of barbarism. The Vikings traded with calculation. They knew the exact value of every item and set their prices according to clear parameters. They were warriors, yes, but when needed, they behaved like bankers. And if Hedeby was the western hub of that network, its eastern counterpart was Birka, located on Lake Mälar, near what is now Stockholm. For centuries, Birka served as a meeting point between Scandinavians, Baltic peoples, Slavs, and Muslim traders. There, on the shores of a calm lake, cultures gathered that would never have otherwise met. No common language was needed. Everyone understood the language of value. Amber, iron, finely crafted weapons, slaves, textiles, and luxury items, far beyond the reach of any northern peasant, were all traded here. Every object carried a story that began hundreds, or even thousands, of kilometers away. Because the Vikings didn't just trade in their own goods, they were masters of moving what belonged to others. They took from one place what was scarce in another. They turned war booty into legitimate merchandise. They transformed stolen gold into bargaining power. Trade and raiding were not opposing activities. They were simply different phases of the same cycle. Sometimes, a raid opened up a new route. Other times, a trade agreement was sealed after years of conflict. The line between violence and diplomacy wasn't rigid. It was a blurred border they navigated with skill. A striking example of this fusion between brutality and economy lies in the slave trade. Uncomfortable as it is, one cannot understand Viking commerce without facing this fact. War captives weren't merely human losses. They were valuable commodities, exchangeable for high-value goods. A strong young man might be sold to Muslim merchants along eastern routes, while a healthy woman could find herself on the auction blocks of southern Europe. There's no way to romanticize this aspect. It was cruel, it was systematic, and it was, without doubt, one of the engines of their economy. Some historians estimate that during the most active centuries of the Viking Age, thousands of people were captured, transported, and sold as property. The impact of this human trafficking was so profound that it even appears in Islamic sources of the time. Arab geographers like Ibn Fadlan described these northern men, whom they called Rus or Majus, with awe, detailing their appearance, customs, funeral rites, and their role in the slave trade. To the east, they were seen as civilized barbarians, a living oxymoron. Men who prayed to strange gods but understood arithmetic, who drank themselves into stupors, yet knew how to honor a deal. This prestige as traders brought the Vikings into far larger networks. Some coins found in Scandinavian tombs originated on the Arabian Peninsula. Coins minted in Baghdad have been unearthed inside chests buried on remote northern islands. How did they get there? The only plausible answer is Viking mediation. Routes that linked the Atlantic Ocean with the Caspian Sea, the North Sea with the Bosphorus. And on those routes, the Scandinavians were not mere passengers. They were gatekeepers, terrain experts, masters of logistics. And their dominance extended beyond the exchange of goods. It included ideas. Viking trade was, in a way, a cultural highway. Along it traveled not just swords and pearls, but words, customs, technologies, even fashion. A carved bone comb found in Ireland bearing Scandinavian motifs, a Byzantine jewel discovered in a Norwegian grave, a Christian cross buried beside a figure of Thor. These are all witnesses to a world in motion, a civilization that understood wealth not only as what one accumulates, but also as what one learns. Organizing these markets required agreements, rules, and consequences. Truces between rival clans or kingdoms were often negotiated for the sake of trade. The stability of a city could depend on caravans arriving without incident, and when that happened, the door opened to prosperity. The most successful Viking cities weren't those that forged the most swords. They were the ones best equipped to welcome foreigners. And here lies the heart of this chapter. The Vikings, those men long seen as the embodiment of chaos, managed to build economic networks that connected a divided continent. They didn't impose a central system or create a universal currency, but unintentionally, they laid the groundwork for pan-European trade, for the smoother circulation of goods, for greater interdependence among distant regions. Because where blood flowed, yes, silver followed. And where the sword carved a path, the market soon settled in. It was this combination, this constant tension between destruction and construction, that allowed the Vikings not to vanish like so many warrior tribes, but to leave an indelible mark on medieval history. And while markets rose in some ports, in others, sieges were being prepared. Because the same talent for negotiation was also a talent for spotting weakness. And soon, very soon, Paris would learn exactly what that meant. The Humiliation of Paris. The Viking imposition reached its most outrageous peak in the history of the city of Paris. To understand the magnitude of the blow, one must imagine the scene. The political and spiritual heart of the Carolingian Empire, a walled city rich in churches, liturgical centers, and teeming with symbols of Christianity and imperial legacy. In the year 85, when the Viking fleet appeared sailing up the Seine, the shock was absolute. Paris, that jewel envisioned as an impregnable bastion, discovered it could fall like a house of cards to an unknown force. The expedition was led by Ragnar, nicknamed Lodbrok, hairy breeches, for his leather trousers, although some identified him at the time as a northern military chief. Those who accompanied him had heard tales of his fame, but few could grasp what that truly meant. Commanding 100 ships and 600 veteran warriors, they advanced along the river unopposed. The existing defenses were insufficient. The pontoon bridges could not hold them back. Overwhelmed, the inhabitants offered gold and supplies in hopes they would leave. It was a survival strategy, but ultimately futile, for this was not a temporary tribute. It was the announcement of an occupation. The Viking arrival transformed the urban landscape. Near the Ile de la Cité, they temporarily settled on the small islet of Platax, known today as Ile Saint-Louis, and from there they controlled the city. The response from Charles the Bald, then King of West Francia, was clumsy and weak. He sent dubious embassies, tribute offers that were rejected, and poorly drafted treaties that guaranteed a swift departure but did not prevent their return. Every Viking victory was a symbolic defeat for the king. There was no moral or strategic channel to reverse the situation. The siege was unlike anything typical of the era. The besiegers surrounded but did not storm the city. They waited from the waters of the Seine. They blocked, then negotiated, and once paid, simply struck camp and moved on. That was the state of Paris, facing silent pressure, an unbearable nightmare for a city that believed it was protected by its proximity to the kingdom of God. It was a prolonged state of humiliation, a constant demonstration of brutal power. Troops disembarked when political circumstances demanded it. A merchant wanted money, a noble awaited ransom. Sit-ins were staged nearby to pressure royal envoys. Tribute was demanded for each city, each river, each bridge. The monetary pressure mounted, and so did the humiliation. Every coin handed over was a renunciation of royal prestige. Every kilo of silver, a blow to Carolingian pride. After weeks of tension, a treaty finally dictated the Viking withdrawal. But this was no victory. It was a forced agreement. Paris would pay a brutal sum for the Vikings to lift the blockade. The funds would have to be extracted from the king's own subjects, increasing taxes. The political cost Charles the Bald paid was even greater. Many of his barons lost faith in him. Paris ceased to be a symbol of power and became a symbol of weakness. What followed was the systematic exploitation by the Vikings. The siege of 85 was followed by other raids in the Seine region. There were lootings, arson, and targeted killings. Some incursions aimed at smaller targets ended deep in Frankish territory, as local defenders had been demoralized by the memory of Paris. The river, once an artery of domestic trade, had become a highway of terror. The humiliation of Paris was also psychological. All of Europe watched. If they could fall, any other city was within reach. Carolingian prestige depended on control of its territory. That authority, upheld by the weight of its tradition, was not being challenged by forces from the West. It was being dismantled by Scandinavians. And it was a multi-layered humiliation, for royal power, for the church, for the people. but there remained something more to prove. That the Vikings could rule, not just plunder. A year later, they returned, under different terms. They offered to leave if granted formal landholdings. Charles the Bald, eager to prevent a second siege, conceded several river settlements near Paris. It was an unprecedented political concession, a Viking legitimized by the king. Those who had destroyed could now begin to build. And the danger changed form. A fearsome warrior with legal permission became a powerful neighbor. Families arrived. Docks and trade followed. Terror gave way to coexistence. Mixed marriages emerged. Weapons began to make room for plows. And although churches were still sacked from time to time, Frankish resistance was transforming. The same men who once scorched the city with fire now cultivated its fields, with the crown's permission. That shift is key to understanding Viking strength. They transitioned from a logic of assault and short-term pressure to a model of sustained, negotiated power. Instead of merely destroying, they began to construct. Rome, Byzantium, Constantinople. Paris, in its unbelievable humiliation, revealed that negotiation was not incompatible with pillage. Kneeling before the sword was, for a weak king, the least political choice, but the most practical one. To understand the full scope, one need only examine the popular impression of the time. While local nobles were busy settling scores, peasants were increasingly aware that war loomed just beyond the hills, and that whoever controlled the Seine controlled Paris, and whoever controlled Paris controlled what was politically possible. That realization would, generations later, transform how Europe's defenses were built, with thicker walls, better planned plazas, and constant vigilance. And though historiography sometimes downplays the event, for contemporaries, it was an open wound. Monks wrote with trembling ink. That attack was neither archaeological nor military. It was a symbolic earthquake. For a people who feared God were forced to bow before those who neither knew nor named him. It was a wake-up call, an announcement that the balance had shifted. And when the Vikings eventually withdrew, they did so having sold more than iron or gold. They had sold the idea that they were masters of their future. Paris had been humiliated, the empire had trembled, and the world knew that history was already changing hands. The witches of the north and the secrets of the future. In the twilight of the Scandinavian forests, where the wind strikes the branches with an ancient cadence and the snow seems to conceal secrets beneath every layer, there lived women who answered to no king, who feared neither blade nor fire, and who spoke with the voice of the gods without moving their lips. They were the Volvas, the witches of the north, the weavers of fate. In a world ruled by sword and blood, they represented another kind of power, the kind that cannot be seen, yet is respected by all, the kind that does not need to shout to be felt. The Viking religion, with its mythology rich in heroes, gods, and battles, also held a hidden stratum, a deeper layer of beliefs connected to magic, destiny, and the unseen. In this symbolic territory, the Volvas moved like fish in water. They were not ordinary healers, nor rural midwives. They were oracles, intermediaries with the unknown, and guardians of a knowledge passed down through generations. When a community faced a crucial decision, war, a journey, an alliance, it was common for a Volva to be consulted before any warlord, because they did not speak from logic, but from vision. The Seda was the art they practiced, a form of magic that combined trance, chanting, invocation, and the manipulation of the threads of fate. It is said that those who mastered Seda could alter reality, bend wills, provoke or heal diseases, foresee the future, and communicate with the dead. And although this practice has been partially reconstructed through the sagas, there are still aspects that elude modern understanding. Because Seder was not a mechanical act, it was an experience, a connection between the witch and the spirits that inhabited the world, including the gods. A satyr ceremony could begin with low, repetitive chants, accompanied by circular movements and soft drumbeats. The vulva would enter a trance, surrounded by female assistants who recited ancient verses, and as the fire crackled and the night closed the circle, she would begin to see, to say what was to come, to warn of betrayals, to point out paths that should be avoided, enemies not yet revealed, or illnesses that were about to emerge. Her word was feared, and often final. Curiously, this form of power was seen as profoundly feminine. Though Cedar could be practiced by men, it was considered shameful for them. In fact, many sources mention that Odin, the supreme god of the Vikings, practiced it. But his enemies used that fact to accuse him of unmanly behavior. Because Seder required surrendering control of the body, entering trance, adopting postures that defied the masculine codes of the time. Thus, paradoxically, the most revered god was also the most transgressive, and that reveals something essential. The spiritual power of the Vikings did not follow the logic of combat. It was more ambiguous, more subtle, and therefore more dangerous. The Volvas, for their part, did not live among common folk. They were nomadic. They appeared in villages when summoned, and disappeared soon after. They wore dark robes, carried staffs carved with runic symbols, and brought ritual objects that no one else could touch without risk. It was said that their eyes did not see like others, that when they looked at a man, they saw beyond his flesh. They saw the cord of his destiny, how long it was, how many knots still remained to be untied. This knowledge of the future was neither precise nor infallible, but it was enough to influence large-scale decisions. Some chieftains refused to launch expeditions without a Volva's approval. Others chose to ignore them. And later, after failing in battle or losing a fleet to a storm, sent offerings to calm the wrath of the spirits. The relationship with Seder was one of respect, but also of fear. Because if a Volva was offended, she could curse. And a Viking curse was no empty threat. It was a symbolic sentence that could ruin crops, provoke internal wars, or sicken the children of a clan. Tied to this universe was the use of runes. More than a simple alphabet, runes were tools of interpretation and power. Each symbol had a name, a sound, a mystical value. They were carved into stone, wood, and bone, used for writing, but also for divination. Runes were cast upon the ground or arranged on the earth, and their patterns were read as a guide. Warriors wore runic amulets. Women hid talismans beneath their clothing. Graves were covered in inscriptions that spoke to the gods, to the dead, and to time itself. And although Christianity attempted to erase these practices, many of them survived, camouflaged, adapted, lingering in the margins of the new faith. Some Volvas became mystics, seers, or holy hermits. But the symbolic foundation remained the same, because the power they wielded did not depend on any specific religion. It stemmed from something older, the bond with the invisible, the belief that the world is not what we see, but what we sense. And in that intuition, they were masters. It is telling that many of the most famous Viking prophecies do not come from kings or warriors, but from these women. It was a Volva who foretold Ragnarok, the end of days. It was a Volva who predicted the death of Balder, the god loved by all, whose fall would mark the beginning of the end. The Sagas are full of their voices, voices that do not seek to persuade or comfort, voices that simply name what is to come. And in that ability to name the future, the witches of the North held a power that no empire, no church, no sword could fully erase. Because as long as there is a need to understand what lies ahead, to face the unknown, their figure will remain alive. Perhaps not in the forest, nor by the fire, nor with a carved staff, but in memory, in culture, in that part of the human soul that still fears fate and longs for a sign. The Volvas disappeared with time, swept away by Christianization, persecution, and forgetfulness. But their legacy endures. It lives in the stories, in the verses, in the words that are repeated without knowing where they came from. And above all, it lives in the certainty that power does not always need to shout. Sometimes a whisper is enough. And while some Volvas foretold the end of the world in incomprehensible songs, others saw beyond the sea. They spoke of new lands, of shores found on no map, of impossible journeys that someone, somehow, would dare to attempt. Because Viking history, like Seder, always kept one eye on the present and another beyond the horizon. The journey to lands that don't exist on maps. In a time when the world seemed to have limits defined by fear, mountains, and the stories of the ancestors, the Vikings dared to look where no one else did. While in Europe people still believed that a great abyss lay at the edge of the ocean, the Norse were readying their ships, packing provisions, and following the wind into the unknown. Thus began one of the most astonishing ventures in their history, the discovery of a continent that maps had not yet learned to name. It began, as great epics often do, with a mistake, with a storm, with a ship thrown off course. But that accident opened the way to a new route. Around the year 980, an Icelander named Eric the Red was exiled for homicide. And like every exile who refuses to die without leaving a mark, he looked westward. He knew, whether someone had whispered it or the rumor had drifted through the fog like a promise, that there was land beyond the ocean. Cold, inhospitable, but real. And so he set out. He sailed for weeks, at the mercy of the waves, with no certainty at all, until he reached the shores of Greenland. There were no green forests, no hidden cities, no buried gold. There was ice, rock, silence. But Eric founded a settlement. He named it Greenland, Land of Green. Not for what it was, but for what he wanted others to believe it was. The name worked like bait. Attracting other settlers was vital for survival, and this semantic trick did the job. Soon enough, entire families were crossing the ocean to start a new life on that desolate frontier. They brought their animals, their tools, their gods. But Eric would not be the only one to look beyond. His son, Leif Erikson, inherited more than just a name. He inherited that hunger for the horizon, that need to see what others could not. Someone, perhaps a lost sailor, perhaps a freed slave, told him of a land even farther away, where tall, dark trees grew, where the coast was not made of stone but of fine sand. Leif listened. He prepared his expedition, and on a journey as risky as any war, he crossed the ocean and reached a new world. That new world would be called Vinland, Land of Wine, or Land of Vines, depending on the translation. It lay across the Atlantic, likely in what we now know as Newfoundland, Canada. And although the official version of history insists that Christopher Columbus discovered America in the 15th century, the Viking sagas tell a different truth. 5 centuries earlier, a young Scandinavian had already set foot on those shores, explored its rivers, built shelters, traded with natives, and returned with the certainty that he had crossed the limits of the world. The Icelandic sagas, blending myth and memory, recount this feat in detail. They speak of forests so dense they blocked out the sky, of unfamiliar animals moving through the undergrowth, of longer days and milder nights. They also mention contact with the indigenous peoples, whom they called Skrællingar. They did not understand them, but they knew they were not easy foes. The first encounters were peaceful. The Vikings offered iron, cloth, tools. In return, they received furs, food, and strange objects. But the tension escalated quickly. A minor dispute, a misunderstood gesture, a spear thrown too soon. Conflict broke out. For the first time in a long time, the Norse were forced to retreat. They had conquered Europe, but in America, they were guests, not masters. The settlements in Vinland were brief. Some lasted a few months, others perhaps a couple of winters. Conditions were harsh, reinforcements scarce, and the sea treacherous. But the experience was etched into the collective memory, not as a failure, but as a vision. The certainty that there was something beyond, that the world did not end at the horizon, that borders were lies told by those who never dared to cross them. Curiously, after Leif and his men returned, there was no major push for colonization. There was no second wave of conquest. Vinland remained a dormant possibility. Some theories suggest that the Scandinavian clans, mired in internal wars, lacked the resources for a transatlantic expansion. Others say the climate changed, making the crossings more difficult. And there are those who believe they simply realized that the new continent was not a land of promise, but a territory that demanded too much and offered too little in return. But even if they didn't occupy it, what they did was enough to shape history. Because Leif Erikson's feat is living proof of a mindset that knew no concept of the impossible. In a time when sailing beyond the known world meant courting death, the Vikings did it. And they did it without maps, without compasses, without certainty. Only with the wind, the North Star, and a will that burned like the fire of their torches. Today, in Lance aux Meadows, on the coast of Newfoundland, archaeological remains confirm the Viking presence. Foundations of houses, tools, iron nails, traces of a brief presence, but an undeniable one. For centuries, this evidence was dismissed, minimized, or ignored. But in the end, history asserts itself. And now we know that before the caravels, before European maps, before the myth of conquest, a group of men from the north had already crossed the ocean. This chapter is not only about geography, it's about boldness, about looking where no one else dares to look, about moving forward when everything urges you to stay. Because the journey to lands that don't exist on maps is not just a story about America. It's a symbol of the Viking spirit, of its vital drive, of its conviction that no sea is too wide, no boundary too final. And while the rest of the world was drawing dragons at the edges of their nautical charts, the Vikings were sailing toward them. The wars they fought among themselves. In popular imagination, the Vikings often appear as a unified force, an unstoppable tide of warriors advancing with a common purpose, destroying monasteries, crossing oceans, and facing foreign armies with unmatched ferocity. But the reality, as with all complex civilizations, was far more turbulent. Because although the Vikings managed to conquer half the known world with a discipline born of chaos, they were also adept at turning that same violence inward, facing each other in wars that were more intimate, more devastating, more personal. The wars they fought against other peoples were epic, yes, but the ones fought between brothers were tragedies carved into living flesh. Scandinavian territory, before the consolidation of the great kingdoms, was a constellation of clans, families, bloodlines, local chieftains, and alliances held together by the fragile threads of honor. Every fjord could be a homeland, every leader a miniature king. In this context, ambition was fuel. And although there were periods of truce, times of alliances between jarls, conflict was the norm. Whether by land or by sea, internal strife was a constant in Viking history. Often, these wars didn't arise from geographical or ideological disputes, but from perceived slights, family rivalries, old debts, or simply the desire to expand one's own power. An insult at a feast, a contested inheritance, a bastard son claiming what he believed was his. One wrong word could trigger a bloodbath, because honor was everything, and not defending it was worse than death. Thus, Viking civil wars were also symbolic battles. Every spear raised said something about who should rule and who should yield. The sagas are filled with these conflicts. They recount, often with heartbreaking drama, the betrayal of kin, pacts broken in the depths of winter, feasts that ended in blood spilled across the snow. A famous example is the family of Egil Skallagrimsson, poet, warrior, and living emblem of the chaos that erupts when pride crashes into pride. Egil not only composed verses in the midst of battle, he also killed his own brother in a struggle for power. His story, told with rawness and beauty, captures the spirit of an age in which the line between love and hate could be measured by the length of a blade. In Norway, the struggle between Harald Fairhair and the rebel clans marked the beginning of unification, but that process was far from peaceful. Harald had to face dozens of minor lords who refused to surrender their independence. Battles multiplied, fields filled with Viking corpses, and the sea became the grave of those who preferred death over loyalty. Even after he declared himself king, Harald's authority was constantly challenged, by his own sons and by those claiming to uphold the old Scandinavian freedoms. Viking blood spilled in the name of a Viking crown, a cruel and frequent paradox. In Denmark and Sweden, the story was no different. Succession lines were always colored by suspicion, betrayal, and forced exile. There was no institutional system to decide who should rule. Everything depended on strength, charisma, and sometimes omens. Warrior kings rose, men who won their thrones through battle and lost them the same way. Often, crowns changed hands like spoils of war, and rulers were fleeting, as though power itself refused to rest too long in one man's grasp. These wars were not always fought on open fields. Many were ambushes, nighttime murders, surprise attacks during a banquet. Sometimes they were formal duels, two leaders deciding the fate of hundreds with a single fight. But even then, the violence spread like wildfire from a single spark. The idea of family vengeance compelled sons to avenge their father's blood, and feuds could last generations. It was a never-ending cycle, a wheel of iron turning over severed heads. The Things, assemblies of free men who debated and judged, tried to offer an alternative to violence. But when leaders refused to accept verdicts, no law could hold back the flood. In those cases, the Thing became a prelude to battle, and what began as debate ended in open war. Oaths, though sacred, were broken when the price of pride was too high. That was the Viking world, a land where words carried sacred weight, but the sword was always nearby in case the pact failed. Death in these wars was not seen as failure. Often it was a kind of consecration. Dying while defending the clan's land, or fighting for the right to be heard, was sometimes more honorable than returning home. That's why many young men volunteered for these campaigns. They went to war not for gold or foreign glory, but for inherited conflicts, for a bloodline that demanded justice, for a family name that needed fresh blood to keep its strength. Internal wars were also rites of passage, moments where youth tested itself. And in the middle of all this, the people suffered. The farmers, the fishermen, the women and the elderly watched their homes razed, their crops burned, their children stolen away. Because in every civil war, there are always voiceless victims. The sagas speak of heroes, of victors, and of the honored dead. But the ashes that blanketed the fields were not sung of in verse. They were gathered in silence, with dirty hands and weary souls. Even so, these wars set the rhythm of Viking life. They were part of its social dynamic, of how they understood power, justice, and destiny. For in a universe where the gods themselves fought among each other, how could men hope for peace? War was not an accident. It was a language, a way to write history. And though the enemy might lie beyond the sea, more often he lived in the neighboring village or the room next door. Because the Vikings, in the end, were not a unified horde. They were a rugged mosaic of fragile alliances, colliding ambitions and burning passions, and the wars they fought among themselves were, in many ways, the ones that defined them most. The Christian crown that changed the North. For centuries, the Vikings were the wild children of the North. Men and women who worshipped gods that demanded courage, who revered death if it came with glory, and who measured life by the edge of a sword. Thor struck with his hammer, Odin whispered secrets in dreams, Loki wove chaos, and Freya cried tears of gold. But even gods tremble when the world begins to change. And toward the end of the first millennium, the North began to transform. What started as a whisper in the ruined churches of England ended with a cross raised over the hills of Scandinavia. The Viking Age didn't end by the enemy's blade. It broke from within, when the cross replaced the hammer, and baptism triumphed over blood. The Christianization of the North was neither simple nor straightforward. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't welcomed with open arms. It was a brutal clash of worldviews, a war without armies in many cases, but with a depth no spear could pierce. Because Christianity was not just a religion, it was a new way of seeing the world, a way that came hand in hand with powerful kingdoms, with writing, with codified laws, with diplomatic alliances. It was a structure, and where the Viking gods demanded sacrifices, the new god offered salvation, in exchange for obedience, for submission, for blind faith. The first king to truly attempt the introduction of Christianity in the Nordic territories was Harald Bluetooth in the 10th century. Yes, the same one whose name now lives on in the wireless devices we carry in our pockets. Harald was a pragmatic leader. He knew that if Scandinavia wanted a seat at Europe's political table, it had to speak the language of the continent. And that language was the gospel. Alliances with Christian kingdoms came easier when you shared their faith. So, under pressure from missionaries and from his own rebellious son, Harald converted. Literally, he was baptized, and he declared that all his kingdom would follow suit. But saying it was one thing, doing it was another entirely. Many clans resisted. They burned churches, killed priests, and defended their ancient carved wooden temples. The men of the North did not easily accept that their gods were false, their rituals pagan, their ancestors mistaken. To them, Valhalla was as real as the rain, and Odin as present as hunger. To change faith was to betray family history, to break the cycle of fathers and grandfathers. It was not just a spiritual shift, it was an act of cultural war. Despite that resistance, Christianity kept advancing, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through the sword. Olaf Tryggvason, king of Norway, was one of the most radical. He had traveled through foreign lands, had witnessed Christian power firsthand, and when he returned, he resolved to impose Christ's faith by any means necessary. His method was simple. He built a church, and those who refused to enter were beheaded. He burned temples, destroyed idols, forced conversion under direct threat. And though his reign was short, his impact was deep. Where once stood altars to Thor, now rose stone crosses. Where sagas were once recited, now the Gospels were read. He was followed by Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf, who combined religious zeal with political ambition. He was crowned king, exiled, returned, and died in battle, trying to reclaim his throne. But after death, his figure grew. He was canonized. And with him, Christianity gained an unstoppable symbolic force. Because when a martyr appears, a religion takes root. Stories of miracles and visions multiplied. It was said his tomb healed the sick, that his soul guided believers. And so, the North began to associate the new faith with a different kind of power. Less violent, more orderly, but just as unshakable. As Christianity took hold, everything that had defined the Viking Age began to shift. The old religion was pushed into silence, into folklore, into songs no one took seriously anymore. Runes were replaced by the Latin alphabet, sagas by the scriptures, the thing by church councils. Oaths sworn before the gods became promises before the altar. The soul of the people was changing, their language, their history. But the process wasn't uniform. In rural areas, the old rites survived much longer. Some communities continued to invoke Freya during childbirth, kept carving protective runes into their doorways, kept offering gifts beneath sacred oaks. It was a partial Christianity, mixed, syncretic, a new faith that coexisted with the whisper of old gods, as if the North was unwilling to completely let go of the spirits that had accompanied it since the dawn of time. And while the church chronicles celebrated each conversion as a final victory, the truth was more ambiguous. Yes, the cross had been planted, but the hammer's roots still pulsed beneath the earth. For generations, many baptized Vikings still feared ghosts, still consulted seers, still believed in the raven's omen. Culture doesn't vanish with a stroke of the pen. It transforms, camouflages, adapts, and that is what happened in Scandinavia. With Christianity also came new political structures. Monarchies solidified. Kingdoms ceased to be loose federations of clans and became more centralized states. The first written law codes appeared. The first cathedrals, the first bishops with real power. The king was no longer just a war leader. He was anointed, consecrated, legitimized by God. He became the bridge between the divine and the earthly. And with that new authority, internal wars began to diminish. Violence was channeled differently. The sword still existed, but now it served the cross. Thus, the old world died, not in glorious battle, nor with the roar of the sea, but in the slow and relentless tide of change. The Christian crown that changed the North was not merely a religious symbol. It was the end of an era, the final page of a story written in blood, in wind, in ice. Because when the last temple was torn down, when the last Jarl kneeled before an altar, the gods of thunder and war understood their time was over. But the memory remained, in the stones, in the names, in the legends that still survive. Because even though the cross ruled the centuries to come, deep in the Scandinavian soul, something of the old world kept breathing. The Empire of Canute the Great. In a world just beginning to grasp the idea of uniting kingdoms, where the word empire still echoed distant memories of Roman power, a man from the north achieved the unthinkable. He brought together under his rule 3 crowns, 3 lands, 3 cultures separated by centuries of war, language, and blood. That man was Canute the Great. And his story is not just that of a king, but of a fleeting moment in time when the Viking world, instead of battering the gates of the south, sat upon its throne. Canute was born in Denmark, the son of King Sweyn Forkbeard, a formidable chieftain who had inherited the ambition of conquering England, as so many Viking leaders had before him. But Sweyn wasn't just a raider. He aspired to rule. And he did, though only briefly. When he died in the winter of the year 1014, he left behind a kingdom won by the sword, but still unsteady. It was then that Canute, young, intelligent, and cold as the sea of his homeland, took hold of that bloody inheritance and turned it into something more enduring. His campaign for England wasn't immediate. After his father's death, he had to retreat, regroup, gather allies, and strengthen his fleet. But when he returned, he came like a foretold storm. In the year 1016, after a fierce war, he defeated the Anglo-Saxon king Edmund Ironside. A pact was signed. Edmund would retain the southern part of the kingdom and Canute the north. But history had other plans. Edmund died just weeks later, and Canute was left as the sole ruler of England. But he didn't stop there. He consolidated power, stabilized the country, and married Emma of Normandy, the widow of the previous king, thus uniting royal houses and legitimizing his position in the eyes of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. He acted with shrewdness. He didn't behave like a barbarian conqueror, but like a monarch with vision. He maintained existing laws, respected local structures, and integrated both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements into his court. Many expected chaos. He offered order. From his new base in England, Canute expanded his domains. He controlled Denmark by blood right. Later, he added Norway, after a sustained campaign against Olaf Haraldsson, the same man who would later be canonized as Saint Olaf. With Norway under his rule, his empire reached its greatest extent, a domain that spanned the North Sea, uniting in a single political structure peoples as different as the English, Danes, and Norwegians. A belt of power few had ever imagined possible. This empire, however, wasn't upheld by any imperial ideology like those that would arise centuries later. It was more of a personal creation, sustained by Canute's skill, diplomacy, and reputation. He was the axis. His presence held everything together. But paradoxically, he knew how to surround himself with wise advisors, influential clergy, and capable nobles, allowing for efficient administration. Unlike many of his Viking predecessors, Canute did not seek to burn cities. He wanted to build. Canute himself converted to Christianity, practiced it openly, and protected the church. But like any savvy ruler of his time, he used faith as a tool of power. He financed monasteries, made public donations, attended solemn masses, and even went on a pilgrimage to Rome. One of the most fascinating episodes of his life was precisely that visit to the capital of Christendom in the year 1031, not as a subject of the Pope, but as an equal. He sought to strengthen his international standing, to show Europe that the Viking king was not a savage-turned-convert, but a cultured, feared, and respected sovereign. But despite his skill, his empire was fragile. It was held together more by his presence than by solid institutions. Deep down, each region still responded to its own loyalties, its own interests. There was resentment in Norway over the occupation, constant tensions in England between Anglo-Saxons and Danes, and ambitions in Denmark that looked more to the east than to the west. Canute ruled with a firm hand, but the cohesion was delicate. He died in the year 1035, and with his death, the structure he had worked so hard to build began to collapse. His sons, unable to maintain the balance of power, fought among themselves and against the local nobility. England fell into other hands. Norway regained its independence, and Denmark entered a new phase of instability. In less than a decade, the most ambitious Viking empire of all time had vanished. Yet Canute's legacy lived on, not in the form of an empire, but as a symbol. He was the last great Scandinavian monarch to dominate England before the Norman conquest. His reign was remembered as a time of order, justice, and relative prosperity. Even centuries later, his name still echoed in songs and chronicles. Canute became a mythical figure, and, as often happens with great men, one of his anecdotes was forever etched in memory. It is said that one day, surrounded by flatterers, Canute led them to the seashore. He had his throne placed on the sand, and before them all, raised his voice toward the waves and commanded them to stop. The water, of course, kept advancing. It soaked his feet, his robe, his entire body. Then he turned to his court and said, "You see how vain is the power of kings. Only God can command the sea." Some interpret this story as a sign of humility, others as an act of irony. But all agree that it was a final scene worthy of a man who understood the true limits of power. Because Canute the Great, unlike so many kings before or after, knew that absolute rule is an illusion, that no empire survives time unless it is built on more than swords and thrones, and that sometimes, even the sea that once carried his ancestors to glory ends up being the quietest and most final judge of all. Stamford Bridge and the last great king. The roar of the gods was fading, but there were still men who could hear its echo. Warriors of ancient blood, raised among sagas and storms, who saw the world not as a field to plow, but as a realm to conquer. And among them all, one stood out for his ambition, his strength, and his tragic destiny. Harold Sigurdsson, known as Harald Hardrada, the Ruthless. He was the last great Viking king, the last one who believed he could defy time, the established order, and the future. His fall was not merely the death of a monarch, it was the final song of an age. Harald was not born in the shadows. He was the half-brother of King Olaf Haraldsson, the same who would die in battle and later be sanctified. At just 15, Harald was already on the battlefield, fleeing the disaster at Stiklestad. His youth was one of exile and steel. He traveled east, served as a mercenary, fought in the Balkans, in Sicily, in Anatolia. He became the commander of the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor, an elite unit made up mostly of Vikings. There in Constantinople, he was shaped not only as a warrior, but as a strategist, a diplomat, a leader. He learned from empires, absorbed languages, understood the intricate game of power. When he returned to Norway, he came back with immense wealth and a reputation that preceded him. For a time, he shared the throne with Magnus the Good, but after Magnus's death, he ruled alone. His reign was anything but simple. He had to consolidate his power, quell rebellions, and hold together a kingdom still clinging to tribal customs. But Harald was forged of iron. He ruled with a firm hand, commanding both respect and fear. He was authoritarian, yes, but also pragmatic. He knew when to strike, when to retreat, when to wait. And yet his gaze always looked beyond the sea, because for men of his lineage, Norway was home, but England was destiny, a land his forebears had raided, invaded, and ruled, a land that, in the Viking imagination, was still part of their inheritance. When King Edward the Confessor died in the year 1066 without a direct heir, the throne of England became a prize for which many were willing to kill. Among them, Harald Hardrada. Harold Godwinson was proclaimed king by the English nobility, but his throne was far from secure. William of Normandy, across the Channel, also laid claim to it. And then, from the north, came Harald Hardrada. He gathered his fleet and sailed to England with thousands of men, accompanied by Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the new king. It was an alliance of convenience, born of mutual resentment. Harold did not come to negotiate. He came to claim what he believed was his by right and by blood: the Anglo-Saxon crown. The landing was a success. The first battles, victorious. They crushed the local forces at Fulford, just outside York. The campaign looked promising. The English army was in the south, awaiting William. No one imagined such a deadly threat would strike from the north. And then, like lightning splitting the sky without warning, Harold Godwinson marched. He crossed over 300 kilometers in barely 4 days. He rallied his forces, and on the 25th of September 1066, he surprised the invaders at Stamford Bridge. It was a perfect ambush. The Norwegian army was unprepared for battle that day. Most of them had left their armor on the ships, believing the enemy was still far away. The clash was brutal. According to the chronicles, a single Viking warrior held the bridge for hours, cutting down every Englishman who tried to cross, until he was finally felled from below by a spear. The battle was long, bloody, and merciless. Harald Hardrada fought as he had lived, without pause, without fear. He stood in the thick of the fray, raising his axe, shouting commands, burning with the fire of a glory he still believed possible. But then an arrow struck him in the throat. He fell, and with him fell the Viking spirit that had dared to dream of conquering England once more. His death was not that of a martyr, nor a defeated emperor. It was the death of a warrior who still believed the old gods watched from above. The few who survived were spared by Harald. They were allowed to return to Norway under the promise that they would never return. Of the more than 10,000 men Harald had brought, fewer than a quarter made it back. The fleet that had arrived like thunder now departed like a lament. And yet, the story did not end there. Barely 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself would fall at the Battle of Hastings, defeated by William the Conqueror. England changed hands, but not through the Vikings. The North was left behind. The age had come to an end. Stamford Bridge was more than a battle. It was the symbolic closing of an era that had begun with the assault on Lindisfarne nearly 3 centuries earlier. It had started with a raid and ended with a failed invasion. The cycle had come full circle. The Vikings, who for generations had been the terror of the continent, were now part of its history, no longer the invaders. They would now be the invaded, no longer the storm, merely the echo of a distant one. And yet Harald Hardrada is still remembered. His figure looms large, almost mythical. A man forged of iron and will, a king who crossed empires, who defied fate, who died with a weapon in his hand. The last great Viking. Not because he was the last to raise a sword, but because he was the last to truly believe he could change the world again, as his ancestors once had. And as the bodies cooled on the grass of Stamford Bridge, as the crows descended and the wind whispered through the trees, something shifted in history. The roar of the North faded, but it still resonates, deep in memory, in stone, in names. Because an era does not die when a king falls. It dies when we stop remembering what the Vikings left in us. When the last Drakar vanished on the horizon, when the fires of the raids died out and the swords hung silently on stone walls, one might think the Vikings simply disappeared, like a storm that passes and leaves the sky calm. But the legacy of a people is not measured only by the battles they won or lost, but by the traces they left behind, slowly and indelibly etched into the world they touched. And the Vikings, though their time has passed, still live among us, in the words we speak, in the laws we follow, in the maps we draw, and in the very way we conceive of courage, adventure, and freedom. Let's begin with something as everyday as language. In England, especially in the regions that were once part of the Danelaw, many common words come directly from Old Norse. Sky, window, knife, egg, take, die, husband. All are linguistic relics from a shared past. Even the days of the week echo the names of Scandinavian gods. Tuesday from Tyr, Wednesday from Odin, Woden, Thursday from Thor, and Friday from Freya. These are not just names. They are quiet reminders that for centuries, the English lived with, negotiated with, and fought alongside the Vikings. The language absorbed their presence because reality could not ignore it. But beyond vocabulary, entire structures of law and social organization were shaped by Viking customs. The system of the thing, assemblies of free men where laws were debated, disputes heard, and judgments made, planted a seed that would eventually grow into more complex parliamentary models. In Iceland, for instance, the Althing still exists as the world's oldest functioning parliament. The idea that power should not rest solely in the hands of a monarch, that the voice of the people, however narrowly defined at the time, should be heard. was a Viking contribution to the long road toward democracy. Because the Vikings were not just raiders, they were settlers, traders, diplomats. In the lands they occupied, Normandy, Scotland, Ireland, and the Northern Isles, they established permanent settlements, intermarried with local populations, founded cities, and built trade routes that connected the north with Constantinople, Baghdad, and beyond. In a way, the Viking world was Europe's first global network, woven together with sails, steel, and treaties. Their trade routes, in fact, carved paths that still define entire regions today. The course of the Dnieper River, linking the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, was used by the Varangians to reach Kiev, and from there, Byzantium. That Scandinavian presence in the east was no accident. It planted the seeds of what would become the Kievan Rus, the foundation of future Eastern Slavic states. Some Byzantine chroniclers describe the Varangian guards as giant men with light hair and incorruptible loyalty. That image, idealized though it may be, remains as a symbol of respect, not savagery. In the realm of art, Viking aesthetics left a lasting impression. Their interwoven designs, dragons, serpents, and fantastical beasts, were incorporated into the Christian art of the lands they conquered. Everyday objects, from brooches to weapons, reveal a taste for detailed ornamentation, for symbols with layered meanings, for a worldview in which every visible thing had an invisible reflection. Even their graves and runestones, many of which still stand in northern fields, are not mere funerary monuments. They are declarations of identity, of lineage, of a past glory demanding remembrance. And if we speak of identity, few legacies are as enduring as cultural imagery. The Viking has been reinvented in every century. In the Middle Ages as a heretic, in the Romantic era as a tragic hero, and in modern times as a symbol of freedom and resistance. Popular culture has dressed them in horned helmets, an error, yes, but a revealing one, because we needed an iconic form for their legend. From comic books to television series, from video games to music, the Viking remains a magnetic figure, representing the untamed, the ancestral, the wild heartbeat that still pulses beneath our civilized surface. Even in science and exploration, traces of that heritage remain. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, reached North America 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus. The sagas that told of this journey were long dismissed as mere legends, until archaeological evidence was found in Newfoundland. That brief presence in the New World proves that Viking curiosity knew no bounds. Where others saw the end of the sea, they saw the beginning of another story. And when we reflect on our own ways of understanding valor, death, and transcendence, we find echoes of the Viking worldview. Personal courage as the highest measure. The belief that a short but glorious life is preferable to a long, empty one. A disdain for fear as the engine of the soul. The notion that deeds speak louder than words, and that death is not the end if one has lived intensely. All of this, though expressed today through different codes, remains part of our popular ethics. When walking through Scotland and hearing surnames like MacLeod or Gunn, when traveling through Normandy and seeing village names ending in Ville, when reading property laws on lands that were once Danelaw, or looking up at the sky during a storm and recalling Thor striking with his hammer, we realize the Vikings never truly left. Their blood was diluted, their ships sank, their temples became churches, but their presence, like the murmur of the sea, is always there beneath the surface. Because truly powerful cultures are not the ones that rule through fear. They are the ones that survive oblivion. And the Vikings, though erased from official history for centuries, keep resurfacing in the margins, in oral stories, in the symbols that still fascinate us. They are part of our collective unconscious, of our family stories, of our hidden roots. When we look back and try to understand what has brought us here, it's impossible not to stumble over them, over their shadow in our words, their voice in our songs, their spirit in our ideas of freedom, destiny, and courage. The voice that still sings in the sagas. When all has fallen silent and the echo of swords has vanished among the stones, one thing remains. The voice. Not the victors, nor the foreign chroniclers, nor the monks who wrote by flickering candlelight. What remains is the voice of the North, born from the wind crashing against the cliffs, from the lips of elders who still recite ancient verses, from parchments rescued from centuries of darkness. These are the sagas, the last refuge of a people who knew how to disappear without ceasing to speak. The Icelandic sagas are not just tales of adventure, they are much more. They are a mirror reflecting the image of a vanished world, told from within. They were composed, dictated, or compiled by authors who lived centuries after the events, but whose blood still carried the pulse of their ancestors. They were not simple stories meant to pass the winter. They were intricate structures, loaded with memory, politics, genealogy, and ethics. The way Viking descendants kept the past alive, shaping their identity with every word repeated. Yes, the sagas contain battles, heroes who sail to the ends of the earth, women who defy the gods, oaths paid in blood. But there is more. There are silences, glances, dilemmas. Honor and betrayal live side by side in characters who are not archetypes, but human beings facing impossible choices. They tell of family feuds that span generations, alliances broken by a single ill-spoken word, loves that end with knives under the moon. And all of it is told without embellishment, in a direct, almost dry language, as if emotion itself were hidden behind a mask of ice. Reading a saga is like hearing an ancient voice, yet somehow familiar, because it speaks of the fear of losing one's home, the longing to endure, the unbearable weight of fate. It speaks of death, of course, but also of life lived intensely, as if every step could be the last. The world of the sagas is brutal and beautiful at once, like the northern landscape that gave it birth. And it was in Iceland that they were preserved. On that solitary island, far from the wars of the continent, where Christianity mingled with the memory of Odin, where the fire of volcanoes seemed to give voice to sleeping gods. It was there, between the 12th and 14th centuries, that many of the most renowned sagas were written. Egil's saga, Njal's saga, the saga of the Greenlanders, the saga of Eric the Red. Each is a unique jewel, but all share a common heartbeat, the heartbeat of a culture that refused to let itself die. What is truly astonishing is that these works did not emerge from palaces or scholars. They were the product of an oral tradition that survived thanks to collective memory. For generations, the skalds, Norse poets, traveled the roads reciting verses that were both history and spell. Their words were not mere entertainment. They were law. They were identity. To remember was to resist, and to resist was to keep alive the flame of a world that time itself wanted to extinguish. That is why the sagas are not just any kind of literature. They are testimony, an act of faith in the power of the word, a way of defeating death. Because the names that appear in them, names that to us may sound distant or impossible, belong to real people, with lives, with failures, with descendants. Some founded villages, others committed terrible crimes. All of them, in some way, are still alive because someone refused to forget them. And there is something more. The sagas do not glorify war for its own sake. They do not turn Vikings into caricatures of blind strength. On the contrary, they show the consequences. The vengeance that drags on until it consumes everything. The cost of pride. The ruin left by broken oaths. There is wisdom in those pages, a harsh wisdom, without easy comfort, but deeply human. Those who read them will not find role models, but mirrors that reflect both the best and the worst of ourselves. These stories crossed oceans. They influenced modern literature more than most people imagine. Jorge Luis Borges drew inspiration from them. Tolkien studied them with devotion before crafting his own reimagined world of Norse mythology. Even contemporary authors like Neil Gaiman have acknowledged that within the sagas lies the seed of much of today's epic storytelling. What the Vikings left behind, ultimately, was not just ruin and ash. They left behind a way of telling the world. Today, in series, films, or novels, the obvious is often exaggerated, and the essential is lost. We see the horns, which they never wore, the orgies and the chaos, but forget what truly mattered: the moral complexity, the dark spirituality, the bond with nature, the art of narrating the inevitable with dignity. The sagas resist that simplification. Those who approach them with respect will find a depth that dismantles every stereotype. Because in the end, every great civilization dies twice. First, when its power vanishes, and second, when its voice is no longer heard. In the case of the Vikings, the first death was inevitable. The second, however, has yet to come. Because as long as the sagas are read, translated, recited, they will continue to exist. Even if they no longer cross the seas, even if their temples lie buried, even if their runes have become code for archaeologists, the essence of who they were lives on in the words they left behind. That is the final victory, not one achieved with swords, but with memory. Not the kind that lasts a generation, but the kind that outlives empires. The voice that still sings in the sagas does not sing to glorify the past, but to remind us that we were more than mud and bones. That there was a time when every man faced his fate with clenched teeth and eyes fixed on the horizon. That there was a people who knew how to vanish, but who never surrendered to oblivion. To listen to those voices is to hear the ancient pulse of Europe. And as long as we keep listening, the Vikings will never have truly died. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt the chill of the fjords, the roar of the gods, or the echo of a saga still singing in the dark, do not let it fade into silence. Subscribe to the channel, share this journey with others, and leave us your voice in the comments. Because as long as we keep telling these stories, the Vikings will keep sailing with us. See you on the next voyage. Good night.